system and the science that we all study that hopefully will kind of spur some conversation. So go ahead and give us the overview, John Pierce. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, sure thing, Caitlin, and thanks everyone. And I'll make this really quick because I know you all want to have a lot of time for discussion. So I just have 8 slides here that Meredith put together based on some other talks that we've given and kind of where we are in the process. So just a couple first introductory slides about what IRAPIC is, which is a consortium sort of platform area for federal agencies to work together on common topics in the Arctic that we want to focus on and move forward on instead of sort of being siloed in our separate agencies. So IRAPIC was created to make progress in the Arctic by creating spaces for the federal agencies to come together. So next slide. And so the tip of the iceberg in this slide is that it is a federal government. Oops. Second slide is actually sort of what is IRAPIC in terms of organization in the federal government. So the office for IRAPIC is actually located in the Eisenhower building in DC, where the arrow points to, and then it's under the executive branch under OSTP, which stands for the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Next slide. So the tip of the iceberg is for IRAPIC is that it is a federal government committee. However, really the big part of IRAPIC is the collaborations, web space and collaborations teams such as this one. And that's where everyone, federal, non-federal, international, university, just citizen can participate, log in and join IRAPIC and take part in these different collaboration teams. And listen to the conversations and help the conversations and move us forward in terms of important things that we need to address in the Arctic. So there's a list there of the different kinds of people that are involved. And if folks are not part of the teams yet, I'd encourage you to sign in or spread this around. And it's also a great place to share information about what you're working on. And when you do that, it reaches over 2,000 people. So it's a great social sort of media platform to share research and activities. Next slide. So the current Arctic research plan will expire in the end of 2021. And so we're currently working on the next one, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the current plan has 4 policy drivers, which are those 4 arrows: global security, stewardship, and well-being. And then as a result of those 4 policy drivers, there's different chapters on those topics in the current plan. And those also have associated research goals and then collaboration teams such as this one that are working to address those goals. And then there's also very specific performance elements that require sort of activities by the teams to try to make progress on those things and then document them on the web space under those different performance elements. So that's what these different check marks are, is just showing how different teams are accomplishing performance elements toward the goals that are ultimately part of the bigger policy drivers. And so these policy drivers are currently what we're talking about is how we're going to develop them for the next Arctic research plan, which will then also drive sort of who and what are the next collaboration teams. So next slide. And so what I've liked to been saying in these presentations is that right now, all we've written so far for the next Arctic research plan is this title page. And so the current plan is under development, but at this point, really what we're doing is seeking information from you all and others about what people think should be in the next Arctic research plan. There actually hasn't been any writing taking place thus far, but the federal agencies are directed by law to write this plan, and IRAPIC coordinates all that. And so the current one ends at the end of 2021, and so we need to start working on the next one so it's ready to go at the start of 2022. So it's based on the intent of the 14 the US federal agencies for their work in the Arctic. It doesn't provide any new funding for that work, so it's just trying to organize the work that is intended to take place in the future, but also in coordination with public input into those plans. And then the plan also provides goals for these collaboration teams to address that will advance sort of what we put in the plan, the objectives that go into the plan, so that we can make some progress, you know, have some solutions and also create some policies that will benefit the Arctic. Next slide. Just some basic facts about the plan. As I said before, it really aligns closely with the goals and the missions of the different federal agencies that are working in the Arctic. The IRAPI plan is a US federal document, so it is written by federal agencies and employees, but with a lot of input from everyone else. So that's what we're seeking right now. The research plan focuses on research, which will be enhanced through cooperation of all these agencies, as I've mentioned before. It doesn't attempt to address all the research, mostly the research that's taking place by the federal government, but as I said, with significant input from others. The plans to date have primarily focused on basic research, but there has been a strong interest in having more applied research included in the next Arctic research plan as a primary goal. And as I've been saying, IRAPIC welcomes ideas for research in any natural or social sciences field. So kind of where we are in the process. Thus far, we've done a lot of review and planning. There's been a lot of meetings to sort of get us ready to start the writing process. But mostly it's been the engagement process to get comments and input on what should be in the next plan. So the first Federal Register notice requesting input has closed just recently, August 2nd, but we still are taking public input, and we don't weigh input through the Federal Register process any more significantly than we do through other channels. And at the end of this presentation, Meredith will show our website where there's different places to provide input. We're still looking for public input through a variety of listening sessions such as this one and other webinars. And then in sort of in that yellow text, just highlighting that there is a workshop that will be taking place through the Plan Development Committee to develop the policy drivers and the research goals that we are informed by the input that we get from today and other sessions. And then we'll move into the drafting and the clearance and release phases, which are discussed in these sort of these next two blocks here. And then I'll just note that there will be a second Federal Register review that will be posted once the plan is actually drafted, and then we'll seek input on that draft before it's finalized. Next slide. So we just want to let you know some of the strong themes that are emerging through discussion of this next Arctic research plan. The first one here is consider the activities and actions that respond to the current input from Northern communities on their priorities. There's actually an entire second sort of separate engagement team that's working with Northern communities about their priorities, so we clearly understand what those are and can incorporate those into the plan as much as possible. Secondly, consider activities and actions that support federal research in support of decision making. So this is getting at that applied research component that I mentioned earlier. That's also emerging as a strong theme. And then lastly, consider how to develop and sustain engagement of Northern communities. So how to communicate best, how to communicate what we do and why we do it, both before and after the research has taken place. And then we're also talking about just possible structures of the new plan. So how to update the current format. You know, should the framework be around a few critical goals or more goals? And then how best to build a plan around policy drivers and what those are going to be. So those are some of the discussions that are taking place right now, and certainly things that we'd be looking for input from you all. Next slide.
I think that's it.
Is that it? Okay.
Yep. And I did take out the ways to give input, because actually this meeting is kind of the very last webinar listening session that we're holding as part of the public input phase. So that's kind of where we are. We've wrapped up the comments, the comment gathering part for this phase, and are starting to transition into using those inputs.
And then I think we were going to show the plan development page just to show kind of where we are and what opportunities still exist for providing input outside of this format.
Yep, I'm pulling it up now.
We could also put that into the chat if people are interested.
Yep, I will put it in the chat.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, John, for the overview. Meredith, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Okay.
All right, so my motivation in convening this webinar, and Joe and I wanted to get us all together here today to illuminate and emphasize the critical knowledge gaps that hinder complete and actionable understanding of Arctic land ice. And not just in some written and formal document, which does exist. Joe and I worked to update the current chapter that's included in the current Arctic research plan, and I can put that link into the chat. But I also wanted to do it in real time with real people. So to get this conversation going, I just sketched out a schematic. So this cross section illustrates very crudely the various realms of the Earth system where the types of icy and snowy and cold problems that we all study reside. Arctic land ice interacts with the lithosphere, biosphere, ocean, and atmosphere. Several compelling broad topics of research occur at these points of intersection and interaction. Now I'm going to illustrate several subcomponents of this system using dotted lines to emphasize key research areas. Rising air temperatures in the Arctic have led to enhanced melting at the ice surface. Melt infiltrates the snowpack and ferns, sometimes developing near surface aquifers within these porous materials, sometimes draining through crevasse networks and moulins to the ice bed interface. That water facilitates sliding and therefore affects overall ice motion. Groundwater interactions and geothermal heat flux play a role here too. The thickness of the ice, determined by the distance from the ice surface to the bed, is only as accurate as available elevation data, and this thickness, combined with the area coverage of the ice body, determine ice volume, which fundamentally constrains how much water is contained within each frozen massive. Calving occurs where the ice meets the sea, leading to floating icebergs and ice melange, and the water from these bits plus meltwater runoff contribute to sea level rise, which causes flooding to various degrees in coastal cities and communities around the world. The cold freshwater from melted ice can affect ocean circulation and marine ecosystems. Several unknowns, including unclear process insight, insufficient mechanical understanding, data gaps, lacking uncertainty quantification, persist. Therefore, we study and we research and read and write and analyze and ponder and work to improve understanding. As it currently stands, and as John sort of summarized for the broad plan, the IRAPI Glaciers and Sea-Level Collaboration Team exists to promote better understanding by, number one, coordinating and integrating observations, and number two, improving numerical models that project Arctic land ice mass balance and its consequences for global and local sea level. So here is where it gets real, which you probably gathered from, John did a really nice job organizing all of this, but there are several activities that relate to this system. So in the current working chapter of the Arctic Research Plan, the various activities are named to provide substance for how exactly this stated research goal, which is a very critical, important, timely, and relevant goal of improving understanding of the machinery and connections and consequences of Arctic land ice and sea level. We need to provide substance for how this goal is actually pursued. So we invoke federal agencies in the United States, including NASA missions like Operation Icebridge, which Joe runs, ISAT-2, NASA ISRO, the Synthetic Aperture Radar, or NISAR mission, the Grace Follow-On mission that collect data to constrain ice volume, mass, and motion. We invoke investigator-driven research funded by the National Science Foundation. We invoke global efforts like the working group activities outlined by the International Association of Cryospheric Sciences. We invoke various modeling efforts captured by this impressive acronym lexicon in the lower right, including the Glacier Model Intercomparison Project, the Ice Sheet System Model, the Parallel Ice Sheet Model, the Energy Exascale Earth System Model, the Ice Sheet Model Intercomparison Project 6, Land Ice Verification and Validation Toolkit, the Model for Prediction Across Scales, Albany Land Ice, or MALI, and Berkeley Ice Sheet Initiative for Climate Extremes, or BICYCLES. We invoke observations collected by the Greenland Ice Sheet Monitoring Network, GLISTEN, and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and Cold Regions Research and Engineering Lab, CREL. We invoke USGS research efforts that investigate glacier climate ecosystem connections driven by direct benchmark glacier measurements. And we host semi-regular monthly online meetings where you all, expert researchers, are invited to present their latest findings and spark interactive discussion. So that gives you a flavor of what Joe and I communicate in our service to IRAPIC and IRAPIC collaborations. But now we want to hear from you. What about this scheme works well, and what are we missing? What has changed since 2016 when the current plan was drafted and this team established? What are the research issues that should be included in the new plan? If the structure of the new plan is similar to what it is now, which don't worry if you're not super familiar, we can get into that as much or as little as we want to. What would we want to change or include? But if the structure is different, how would we want to reconsider this team? So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen. If I can figure that out, stop share, there we go. So please ask questions, share ideas, and feel encouraged to speak to your perspective. We really appreciate you being here today. And we've got a couple of comments in the chat already. Yeah, so thank you, Joe. Put a refresh draft of the team 5-year plan. It's not final, anyone can comment, but we'll now open the floor to questions, comments. Feel free to just talk about what you're thinking deeply about and what you see as important in this Arctic land ice system.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. I'll just, if I can just add on to that to just encourage people, what we're really after is what's important to you when it comes to the federal government prioritizing research for glaciers and sea level change. And so Caitlin gave you a great overview of that, whether it's a billion-dollar mission like ISAT-2, all the way down to investigator-driven projects. There are specific performance elements that are associated with that. So this is the opportunity to highlight those, to highlight where you see the science going, and what's going to happen in the future. And as Meredith mentioned, this is indeed our very last listening session for IRAPIC in this regard. And partly that's associated with Caitlin and I being relatively junior to this process and new to it. And so our first step was to update that the previous 5-year plan, which I linked to in the chat, and anyone can take a look at that. And so we refreshed that with projects that we knew had come into being or been deprecated, and same for models, etc. And but really, we want to get a little more feedback from individuals straight up. So so that's what we're after today. Yeah. Caitlin, I want to add anything to that? Oh, okay. Actually, Martin's already started us off here, and thank you, Martin. And that's a good question. How does IRAPIC influence decisions of funding agencies? How did this happen during the last iteration? And do NASA and NSF react specifically to the report? Well, I can't directly speak to how that happened in the last iteration because I wasn't involved directly with IRAPIC at the time. Perhaps Meredith or John could. But I can't say that NASA, at the very least, does react specifically to this report. And it's one of the ones that's called out in, for example, the recent NASA Cryospheric Science call in the ROSES 2020 solicitation. What IRAPIC prioritizes is mentioned in that report. I'm less certain about NSF, but this is one of those reference federal reports that people use to guide what's considered community priorities. Meredith or John, can you speak to the previous iteration of the 5-year plan? Were you around back then?
No, I can't really. Roberto Delgado's online from NSF. Roberto, I don't know if you could speak to that question.
And Chad actually was previously on the Glaciers and Sea Level Change team, so you can speak to that too. Go ahead, Roberto.
This is Roberto. So from the NSF standpoint, certainly it's the funding decisions are obviously made through our merit review process. I think how the IRAPI plan sort of influences is the extent to which different proposers are able to tie their research to some of the research objectives and goals that are put forth in the plan. And so, for example, sometimes addressing the broader impacts of their research such that it is consistent with this national reference document can sometimes strengthen the overall proposal. But again, NSF relies on the merit review process, intellectual merit and broader impacts. And so it's an indirect way of influencing any given particular decision. That really is based on the reviews that are submitted, as well as with the panel discussions. And so I would say, again, indirectly there is some influence based on the research goals of the plan that may coincide with the specific funding decisions from NSF.
Hey, Joe, is it better that I comment in the writing, or is it okay to speak? All right, I'm gonna keep going here.
No, you're speaking. Go ahead.
I just thought sometimes it makes it a bit more dynamic, but sometimes it just doesn't work. So the research goal seems really narrowly defined to me, a research goal 5, and I'm assuming that's what was handed to the both of you as the research goal. So it's mass balance and sea level rise. And it would have been nice to see some language, not just about the continuation. I see a lot about continuation, but about really the gaps that we currently have. And I know that some of it's hinted on there, but I think some important things are missing. And that is there's two things going on. There's the processes at the surface, and then there's the processes at the ice-ocean interface. And then there's the internal response of the ice itself. And so one, we need bedrock. We don't have that for most ice in the Arctic. So that would be my highest priority. And second would be ocean monitoring. We don't, the water gets into these narrow fjords, and that's really what's forcing the dynamic response. And we don't really have a good observing program for that. So it'd be nice to see some kind of forward-looking stuff that's not just the continuation of the programs we have in place. And then the other thing is then once we have those kind of boundary conditions, it comes down to what are the processes that we're lacking. And the processes that we currently don't understand are changes in the basal friction. We don't understand the calving. And then we also have a really poor handling on the impact of impurities and biota on the surface and how that influences the surface mass balance and the processes that evolve the surface. And so it would be nice to see those kind of listed out in priority so that we could advance on the understanding.
Yeah, so I certainly I don't disagree with you with the sort of the broadest framing of how the research goal is titled, and I think that should be open to being adjusted to more clearly reflect the processes. We have to understand some of these processes better. That's better captured deeper in the document, but some of the processes you mentioned toward the end, for example, surface albedo, are not currently in there. Relative to 5 years ago, I doubt anyone here would dispute the increasing importance of understanding ice-ocean interactions. And Caitlin and I tried to add a little bit to that, but perhaps one way of framing what you're suggesting is just calling out, either in a performance element or title more directly, just the sheer breadth of processes for which we're still not certain what's going on there in the Arctic. Is that a fair characterization, Alex? Sorry.
Yeah, I think our community, unlike a lot of other communities, has a really good handle on what we need and what we need to understand to really make progress. And I think there's pretty good agreement across our community. I know there's some debate in different areas, but making sure that comes off clearly in the document, that we know that sea levels are going to rise. The question now is how much and where and when. And in order to be able to refine that answer, this is what we need. We need to know what the ocean's doing. We need to know what the bedrock is. And we need to know these few key processes, and anything that can be done to advance that will help reduce the uncertainty in the future projection of sea level change.
Yeah. Agreed. Does anyone want to add anything directly along those lines? Caitlin, have you been monitoring the chat?
Yeah, I was just gonna give voice to a couple of comments here. So Jack Dibb wrote that another fundamental question is whether this chapter should or will appear in the next plan. So if the framework changes a lot, perhaps with a few cross-cutting themes, it may not be an obvious standalone activity. And I see particular potential for good synergy with sort of a more ocean-oriented, you know, we'll see what it looks like, but not so much team, but to get more conversation and, you know, and again, this is sort of, I'm happy to have you all here in the room, and I'm thinking of Lee in particular, maybe Doug Brinkerhoff too. I know that you all have been involved in, you know, sort of big Greenland ice ocean interaction projects. And so we just want to make sure that, you know, I agree with you, Alex, that there is some consensus across our community, which we all understand, but making sure that that is reflected in this this Arctic research plan development process and also the document. So that's the comment from Jack, is that we should all keep this possibility for flexibility with the structure open in our minds. And then Lee also made the point, which actually, Lee, could you turn your mic on? Do you just want to ask your question?
Yeah, so I was, you know, I just skimmed it briefly, so I might have missed it, but I think we're still like really trying to understand variability a lot better. Michaela has been focusing on this a lot as well. And, you know, in a 3-year grant, that's 2 years of field work before you pull your instruments. And it's really hard to make broad statements about processes from that short time period. And I know, you know, there are forms for different long-term observing in the Arctic, but that's really hard and has been, I think, limiting for us, particularly, you know, ocean variables. We can't do that very well with remote sensing. And so, you know, having some flexibility, maybe it's a 3-year grant spread over 6 years. You're only going to the field 3 years, but you have longer to do it. Or if there's some way that we can accommodate and try to understand variability better, I think that's going to be really important for us.
Yeah, we've got to, thank you, Lee. That's a good point to emphasize, and kind of goes off of something that Alex mentioned about having a, you know, improved ocean monitoring observing program. And, you know, those long, I mean, I know we're really sensitive to the role that the USGS Benchmark Glacier Project plays in sort of the landscape of otherwise sporadic mass balance measuring programs. So you kind of get, that's one benefit of having these sort of federally funded programs. But another thing I wanted to draw attention to in the chat here, Shad first asked is, well, I don't know, Shad, do you want to unmute yourself so you can say it yourself? And then Jack, you can, I don't know if you can turn your mic on, but it's about snow. And I think HP was going to try to come, who sits in Boise, HP Marshall, and he actually replied and said, I don't know if this is the group for me, because I've really been focused more on snow. But so I sort of emphasize that obviously snow is a very important part of the surface mass balance on all of these Arctic land ice masses. So Shad, do you want to speak up to your question, or do you want me to read it?
Sure. I guess, you know, my time over the past 5 or 6 years with IRAPI, the snow seems to have slipped through the cracks in all of the collaboration teams. And I don't think it's necessarily just related to mass balance of glaciers and ice sheets, but terrestrial snow processes too, and the water resources that come from that snow. You know, it should cross-cut between this team and the terrestrial ecosystems team, but that team seems more focused on the ecology. And I don't know how to recraft things, but it would be great to see, you know, whether it's the emphasis of the glaciers and sea level broaden to more general cryosphere topics, or if snow creeps in some other way, but it's glaringly absent.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And Jack writes in the chat that it could be a good cross-cutting theme with major impacts on ecosystem function, hydrology, geochemical cycling, in addition to the mass balance and albedo of land ice. And then Doug Brinkerhoff, I don't know if, do you want to unmute yourself so you can make your good point here about timescales and specifying that?
Yeah, sure. My point, I guess, is while we're thinking about how to address these sorts of research questions that appear in the title of this document, which is to understand and project the mass balance of glaciers, ice caps, and the Greenland ice sheet, and of course their consequences for sea level rise, it's really important to think about the time scale over which we care to make those projections, because the type of science that I think you're going to do, if you want to know what sea level rise is going to be in, I don't know, 10 or 20 years or something like that, versus what it's going to be in 1,000 years, is pretty different. In particular, the former would need to focus a lot more on ice dynamics and the sort of dynamics processes that Alex was mentioning earlier. And if it's the latter, if we're looking more at sort of long-term changes, then I think we'd be a lot more interested in things like surface mass balance and climate ice coupling, stuff like that. So I just think it's important to be specific about that, and it'll definitely guide the sort of research direction that IRAPIC wants to emphasize.
Mm-hmm. And then
agreed, Doug. And
go ahead, Joe.
And if I could say, I think based on my based on the other themes that that IRAPIC considers and the other collaboration teams and the timescales that they're typically interested in, I think it would be the shorter of those timescales, the coming decades through this century, and that would appear to be the natural focus of the work as it stands currently. So it would be a bit of a retooling to go further. But I agree that timescale is never, I don't recall it being explicitly called out as the priority in the current document, but that would help focus it a bit.
Well, and on that topic of timescales, Liz has a comment here in the chat. Liz, do you want to unmute yourself to make this important point, interesting point? I could read it too, either way.
Yeah, sure. I was just pointing out that the question of which timescale is relevant is at least as much a values question as it is a scientific question. And so it's not necessarily just for us to decide. So I don't think we could decide in this meeting. We do care about 20 years and we don't care about 1,000 years, or vice versa. So that's an area where I think it's important to bring in the commentary from northern communities and also coastal communities that was mentioned in the first presentation.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And that's something, yeah, IRAPIC has made me really think actively about, especially because we're sort of in this realm where, you know, some of the good questions, which Shad had a comment about how IRAPIC ends up in sort of this realm of influence at the federal level. And so I think it is important that we as a research community are thinking about not just how do we execute in terms of getting, you know, sort of physical answers, but maybe also a little bit about who we're talking to and who we're doing the work for. So I don't want to get too philosophical here, but it's definitely something that, at least as it's currently organized, IRAPIC is really well suited for making these sorts of connections with, for example, northern communities that might otherwise be sort of not very straightforward or easy to make for folks who have been not trained in social science or in making those sorts of connections. So we're kind of all over the place with topics, but I think this is really, really good. We have another comment here from Jonathan Nash. Do you want to put in your upvote for the importance of long-term observations?
Sure. I mean, I'll just very quickly, I guess I'm thankful that NSF is very much supporting, you know, process-driven experiments and, you know, Lee's comments about having a long-term location or something where we would have a long-term observational focus. I think that sounds, that's an important part. The other thing I was just thinking also was having some repository, or, I mean, I think this forum is awesome for bringing groups together, but knowing what research is being done by whom and bringing all that together to facilitate that somehow, I think would be another important contribution. Yeah, thanks for organizing this. Yeah,
thanks so much for attending. Martin, you have
Caitlin, can I?
Yeah,
can I
sorry,
ask,
go ahead, Joe.
Sorry, my audio is a little shifted. But going back to Jonathan and Lee's comments, I know there was a CLIVAR working group, I think that was the correct term, that discussed sort of longer term ocean observations in proximity to the Greenland ice sheet. Is there, can you, one of you, if you were involved, briefly discuss what the current state of that is? Because I don't think we're capturing that very well. And part of what you see in that 5-year plan that's there, that's to some degree limited by the knowledge that Caitlin and I possess and those whom we can repute to help contribute. So it'll be, can you guys speak to what the state of that is? Is that something you consider important? It's totally fine to call out specific projects or initiatives in this document.
I don't, I can try to look it up and provide some text though. I don't, I know of it, but I don't know enough details to be useful at this stage.
Okay.
And I don't as well, so.
Okay, well, hopefully we'll be, hopefully we'll be able to get someone who can. Sorry, back to you, Caitlin.
Oh, I was sorry. It's always tricky with these chats to both listen to everyone as we're talking and also pay attention to the chat. So thank you all for continuing to discuss, and yeah, feel free to just keep an eye out too as IRAPIC evolves with the development of this next 5-year research plan. And you know, there might be slots where that kind of those chunks of information could be really helpful for communicating to the community. But going back to the sea level piece, Martin, you have a comment here about stressing the local and regional effects. Do you want to speak to that comment?
Sure. So one thing that always strikes me is that when we talk, especially land glaciers, the impact on global sea level is often not nearly as large as the regional impacts. In particular, you look at tidewater glaciers, and for example, the retreat of a tidewater glacier on land has extremely profound impacts on local ecosystems and so on. And a big piece of what's happening there is not just the glaciology, but it's the physical oceanography, overturning in fjords, etc. And also, I think a piece we don't give as much attention to as we maybe should is the whole sediment dynamics. How glaciers erode, how they transport sediment, where they deposit them. That has impacts, again, on fjord ecosystems. It has impacts on glacier stability, etc. So I would just stress kind of these local processes and local effects as well.
And then Jessica has a nice comment here too, but before we go to that, maybe Matt Hoffman, if you could also give voice to your comments about the point that local and regional sea level changes aren't always sourced by nearby ice.
Yeah, and I think the document is quite impressively extensive on models and other methods for looking at the land ice contribution to global sea level, but translating that to regional or local sea level rise. I think is completely absent right now. So if the heading for this section is meant to be projecting the mass balance of glaciers and ice caps and the Greenland ice sheet and their consequences for sea level rise, if that sea level rise bit is meant to be exhaustive, then I think there really is a need to include additional types of models as in this list, including GIA and sea level equation models that can really translate the global sea level impacts to the local level, which can be quite a bit different than the global mean, as we know. And then I think it's also worth acknowledging that if we're looking at local or regional Arctic sea level changes, that these are going to be affected by sea level contributions from outside of the Arctic. And I'm not suggesting that Antarctic ice sheet modeling should fall under the purview of IRAPI, but I think it's worth acknowledging that uncertainties in what's happening at the other pole and across the rest of the globe regarding sea level could have significant impacts on being able to project local sea level in the Arctic. And then, as Martin alluded to, the very local piece is kind of additive on top of that in terms of what's happening with sediment and local ocean conditions. So I think that's a kind of another thrust that could be added is the tools needed to really address local sea level.
Mm. So Jessica,
yeah, that's a great.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, that's a great point, Matt. And actually, our last Glaciers meeting it discussed exactly that topic, but it's not currently captured in the document very well. So we should definitely endeavor to include that.
And just to chime in here, I think this is something that the Surge Land Ice Interaction Team struggles a little bit too, because we talk about sea level change due to changes in the Arctic, but clearly this is a very connected piece. So I fully second what Matt just said.
And not to belabor the point, but if part of IRAPIC is to really tie this back to local communities, that being able to translate from global to regional and local sea level is critical, because the global mean is not particularly relevant in terms of planning for impacts.
Yeah, on timescales that are relevant to those local activities as well. We have a comment here from Jessica to switch gears a little bit that is about data. Jessica, do you want to give voice to that?
Sure. I know that the main focus of our conversation in this document is really thinking about the science goals, but I think as we get at some of these different plans and objectives, a lot of what we're doing is thinking about how to sort of answer these really complex questions that use a lot of data. And so I just wanted to sort of put a reminder, and given it is an important document for influencing, thinking about funding and where our goals are, as we think about developing this long-term monitoring station and what that looks like, I think thinking about the data side of that, the data management, the data sharing, the data usage is going to just be an important piece. It's something we've seen, in my experience a lot with the ISAT-2 data sets, is they're very large, they're very nested. And so there's a severe learning curve to, start working with them. And I mean, it's great because of the complexity of the data allows us to ask and answer really interesting questions, but I think it's just something important to keep in mind as we're thinking about what our goals are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
the science.
Thank you for mentioning that. Billy, I see your face pop up. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, if it's okay, I just wanted to piggyback on that. Because to me, I mean, yeah, that seems like something where the government and federal agencies are uniquely suited, and this is going on top of things that Lee was saying. But to do these longer term projects and potentially also, to have data, like you were saying, Jessica, to be the focus, where, yeah, I mean, there's so many data products where just, you know, generating that project is such a heavy lift that an individual user, it's going to take them years just to get there. And things like Alex Gardner and other folks at JPL are doing with data sets like It's Live, these sort of massive velocity data sets, that Matthew Morlicam and Daniel Ferranati, these big ice thickness data sets, these kind of things are super important contributions that's something, I think the federal government has a great position to be able to support those kinds of things that really, I think, help the entire community flourish by having these big data sets to build off of.
Oh, Caitlin, I'm not sure, is my mic working now?
Yeah, go for it, Jack.
So one thing, and I spent a lot of time with the discussion of the atmospheric team as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I am a little bit concerned that both of these groups are very much assuming that we're talking about updating and tweaking the current structure of the current plan. And if you go back to the opening talk about, potential emerging themes and the focus on northern communities, I'm just wondering if any of the current teams are going to be nimble enough. I mean, I think you could frame a really broad cross-cutting initiative for the next Arctic plan that we want to document and understand the forces that are causing changes to the cryosphere and how those are impacting northern communities. And that would fold in the sea ice team and this team and the permafrost team and the terrestrial ecosystem team all into one major theme. And I don't understand how the process moves forward. I mean, who's going to make these high-level decisions, whether it's just a slight editing of the current version to reflect that some projects actually happened and new ones are starting? Or is it really looking for a bold, completely new approach? And I don't know the answer, and I don't, maybe Roberto knows or maybe nobody knows yet. But I do know way back at the beginning of kickoff meeting for all of IRAPIC, Simon was saying that maybe we need less goals. Mm-hmm. Right? We need a few more bigger goals. And then you're still going to have all the sub pieces deeper in, right? So it's just something for the whole group to think about. And I don't know the answer. I admit it 100%.
Caitlin and Joe, may I take a stab at that?
Please do.
Roberto. So yeah, Jack makes a very good point, and recalling earlier discussions and conversations and listening sessions and all the different attempts that we as IRAPIC, not as an NSF individual funding agency, have made to reach out to the broader research community with respect to developing the next plan. There isn't a final answer at this point. That's something that we're really trying to stress as we solicit the input from these different venues. Of course, we were challenged in not being able to hold in-person meetings among northern communities in the state of Alaska and elsewhere because of the pandemic. But regardless, I think we were able to get a fair amount of information and input and recommendations from a broad sector of groups, nonprofit organizations, state of Alaska, industry, in addition to academia, other federal agencies, as well as local, state, tribal organizations and Alaska Native tribes. And Meredith has some background information about that although we're out of time. But there will be this plan development workshop next month where a broad group of these diverse stakeholders will be essentially finalizing the framework and the content and the scope. And so nothing's been predetermined as yet, but by next month we will have a much better idea after, I think we're doing three or four half days worth of meetings and discussions and breakouts to really finalize and reach some sort of consensus on the priorities on both the scope, the content and format of that next plan. And then we'll begin writing the drafting process.
Thanks, Roberto.
Yeah, thanks, Roberto. And we are approaching the top of the hour. So if people need to move on to their next thing, feel free. But this is it's so great to have everybody convened here and providing their input and perspective. And so I'm happy to continue chatting. I'm especially keen to hear from some of the people we haven't heard from yet. That being said, feel free to go on with your day if you have other commitments. And yeah, thanks, Jack. I really have appreciated your kind of to the heart questions over the course of this process. And you know, as I mentioned at the top of this hour, my motivation in convening us today is to sort of make sure that all of our expert knowledge is injected into this process. So even though we're dealing with a structure that is, you know, potentially, it sounds like probably under revision, you know, IRAPIC, at least in my opinion, is a really amazing platform for connecting researchers with one another, connecting, you know, smoothing the logistics, so making connections for fieldwork and that sort of thing, but also making connections between researchers and program managers and the native communities as well. So it's kind of, I think there's a lot of potential for this activity to continue to benefit the community. And so I just started to feel more and more passionate about making sure that our sort of perspective is shared and captured in a way that's more than just this one document. So we've thinned out a bit. Thanks, Jonathan Nash, for coming, and the other international participants. I know it did end up being kind of a very US-centered conversation, but I think that having some international expertise in the room is definitely always welcome in this forum. So I'm going to do the thing where I call somebody out who I know is Toby. Are you thinking, I know you're thinking about groundwater interactions at the ice bed interface. Is there anything that you see as important to explain, highlight?
Yeah, well, I guess that's one question that came to my mind is just, and I think Alex touched on it at the very beginning, that the title is quite focused, right? And so where does that leave, or does that leave room for other potentially important research questions, and especially ones that maybe connect other elements of that wheel diagram at the very beginning, that was presented at the beginning of the of this meeting. So, and like, just to throw out one example, one is, as you mentioned, Caitlin, one that we're quite interested in thinking more about, which is the connection of groundwater, the oceans, and the Greenland ice sheet. And it's not clear that, you know, sort of this connection has large implications for sea level rise, but it does have large implications for sort of our understanding of the hydrologic cycling in the Arctic, which is important to other elements of this wheel diagram. So, but it's not clear how that fits into this sort of the current structure of the document.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for speaking to that. And I think, yeah, maybe, I mean, yeah, I've talked enough, so I'll maybe share with you offline what my, the way that my thinking intersects with that comment. But Sarush, or do you have any thoughts to share as you've been listening and given what you've been deeply thinking about lately?
Yeah, totally.
If I get trousers on.
So first of all, excellent conversation. I'm really enjoying this kind of conversation from different perspectives coming in together. I guess the point that I want to make is when we talk about the processes, there's some very fundamental things we don't understand in terms of sliding, calving factors and all that. I don't think that this is something new that we understood that we didn't know 5 years ago. Probably since like maybe 15 or 20 years ago, we still knew that we don't know anything about these things, or very little. So I assume that this is a section that really didn't change since 5 years ago up to now. And this report, I'm just thinking along the ways that how we can change the framing of these questions to not be the same thing that, hey, we don't know these. I'm thinking about like how we can make this more concrete to say that these are exactly the things that we have learned since the last time. And these are the things that should really improve, because there has been improvements. But at the end of the day, we don't exactly know which ones matter. So that's one way to put it, to say that, be more specific about what we don't know about sliding, what we don't know about calving, what we don't know about fractures. The other way of thinking about this is, I guess if I want to think about like some sort of logistic and engineering perspective, this is going to be a 5-year plan with some limited funding. So if we want to make any kind of sea level projection with limited funding, we have to kind of have this sort of hierarchy of which parameters are important the most. So I guess that is also something that we don't know yet that well. We don't know which of these processes that we don't know well are the most critical things to know for the objective that we want to reach. So maybe even some sort of direction would be how to quantify which parameter is important the most. Which of these parameters that we don't know the most are going to be more critical in the future forecasts. So something along those lines is something that I was thinking that could be useful, but maybe it's a little too detailed.
No, that's, I mean, I think that sort of theme of, you know, what is the value system by which these themes are prioritized is really relevant. So thank you. Thanks for tuning in. It's so fun to see you all also, by the way. I hope you're well. I think everybody who's still on the line has had a chance to speak up. I know that there's quite a lot. I've been taking notes. I know Meredith has been taking notes as well. I know, Liz, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I know you're somebody who thinks deeply about fracture mechanics and calving, and from your perspective, and I mean, I don't want to, I guess one thing that John said at the beginning that we should keep in mind is that, you know, IRAPIC and these documents aren't necessarily meant to be exhaustive, and it is sort of, they're a diagonal influence on the offices and procedures by which funding decisions are made. But Liz, is there anything that you saw as sort of a glaring oversight in terms of, you know, some of the specifics that could help with this objective that Sarush mentioned of, you know, helping clear priorities pop out for what measurements are missing, what processes really need to be interrogated?
I'm just looking at the draft. I didn't see fracture mechanics mentioned as an example of a process you might want to target in investigator-driven studies. I can email you though. We can talk about this offline.
Okay, sounds good. I guess, and it's probably apparent, but the other thing, well, maybe it's not apparent, but this is all sort of a goodwill activity. So this is something that Joe and I volunteer to do, and you all have volunteered your time to be here as part of this conversation today. But I think the more that we can kind of make the process of sharing our knowledge and expertise efficient by just keeping communication channels open is really beneficial. So we've got Jessica had to sign off, she says in the chat. And I see another couple things in the chat here that I will read, but I guess any other concluding comments? Martin, I guess the weather is not so great up in Alaska because you didn't end up flying today after all.
Yeah, we just came back from the Brooks Range, so we're just transitioning here. I have one more question, which is when we talk about northern communities, how, this is a question that always comes up for us glaciologists and Arctic science. How northern is northern? For example, are communities along the coast of Southeast Alaska, are they included in this discussion or not? Because a lot of the glacier change is much more an issue for Tlingit than it is for Nupiat, I would say. And I'm just curious how far that involvement of local communities, how far south that extends, because the glaciers certainly go well far. Actually, all the glaciers in Alaska essentially are south of the Arctic Circle and not in what's usually considered the Arctic.
That's actually a question. Meredith, do you mind if do you have any insight into?
Yep. Yeah, we have focused a lot of the effort in relationship building with regional indigenous people and entities on kind of the federal definition of the Arctic in the ARPA. So it's like includes the Aleutians, but then it cuts off, I think, north of the Kuskokwim and over. But in our outreach to tribes, we sent letters to all the tribes of Alaska, and I think that we were kind of following the example of NSF and their NNA proposal, which asked for people to think about connections broadly to the Arctic. So that's kind of walking a line there a little bit.
Martin, do you have any experience working directly with those communities and kind of merging your research, maybe even in like question development and kind of having a co-knowledge production?
Yeah, not a whole lot. We used to work a little bit with the Tlingit tribe in Yakutat, but when we were trying to study Hubbard Glacier, but we never actually were successful in funding there. We just got a proposal funded on the Malaspina Glacier, and we actually are as part of that. So this is just starting. Are hoping to engage with the tribe in Yakutat as well. So I don't have a lot of experience there, but this was always a question in glaciology as well. You know, are we Arctic enough for the Arctic? I think it extends from the physical science to local involvement as well.
Yeah. I guess I'll just share quickly one aha moment I had this summer, which I'm a little embarrassed to admit, but I had sort of thought of the information transfer as very one directional, like communities just need information on how high the water will rise by such and such date. And then from listening to some of the people speak on an IRAPIC webinar from Nome, I realized that that may or may not be useful information. And there may be a lot more interest in some of the topics we've mentioned today on how glacier retreat affects the hydrologic cycle, about how it affects the stability of slopes surrounding the community. And so I think, I don't know, I'm starting to appreciate more and more how that it takes some humility and it takes some sort of deconstructing, at least in my mind, of the way that sort of scientific questions are developed, thinking only about the physical system. But yeah, it's keep in touch. I'm interested to see how those efforts go, and I certainly am interested in making sort of that type of communication a little bit more of a focus for our USGS research group too. So we're about a quarter after the hour. Unless anybody has any concluding comments, I really appreciate you all being here. And actually, we totally skipped over it, but Joe was going to mention some words of sort of acknowledgement and condolence for Connie Steffen's death in Greenland last weekend. I know that that's really reverberated through our research community, and we talked about whether or not we should proceed with this webinar, and sort of decided that you know, a dedicated scientist would like to see other dedicated scientists continue to do science. So we decided to forge ahead, and yeah, I guess just keep the channels open. I know that's one of several things to contend with this summer, and so yeah, thank you all for being here. Any other concluding comments?
Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you, Billy. I know you've got a newborn and any other sort of complicating factors, so you made it happen. Thanks, Liz. All right. Well, and I guess I'll emphasize too, Jack, I do really appreciate you mentioning that a lot of this sort of plan development and listening and whatnot has happened under. I've learned a lot about how these sorts of procedures operate and proceed, and so I might have done it a little differently. Joe and I might have made some different decisions if we were a little more seasoned and had a better understanding of exactly how the procedure was going to unfold. But then in retrospect, I see that that information was indeed available. But anyway, hopefully we'll have a really dynamic revamp of IRAPIC, its structure, and hopefully the Arctic Research Plan captures all of these emergent and acute areas of research needs. And thank you all for being here. I've said that like 18 times now, but we'll let you go, and have a good day, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Good to see you. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. You guys did a great job running this discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Much appreciated.